Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1306, or U.S. History after 1877. This will be the last lecture for our course, and we're taking a look at the 1970s. It's not unusual that we don't quite make it all the way up to the present, and in this instance we stopped about 50 years short. Not too bad. But there are some major developments happening in the 1970s after the civil rights movement comes to an end. And mostly what we're going to be focusing on within this lecture is sort of foreign diplomacy and overseas affairs, coupled with a lot of domestic crises that are happening in the United States. With that in mind, we need to take a look at a long-standing issue that would embroil the United States on a global stage, and that is the issue of the settlement of Israel and the place of Palestine within the world. This goes all the way back to just right after World War II. In 1947, the United States, working from within the UN, had been a very critical proponent of securing a homeland for Jewish people who had been displaced by the Holocaust in World War II. In order to make this happen, the United Nations partitioned the former colonial holdings of the United Kingdom in the Middle East. Namely, they took what was known as British or Mandated Palestine, which had been created in 1920. And they took that territory and created the modern state of Israel in 1947. Even before this time period, there was a surge of Jewish migration into this territory during the war. But an even larger number starts to come in after 1947. And this left the people who were living in British or Mandated Palestine, Palestinians, very, very resentful of the incursions into what they considered to be their lands. And of course, this is still very much a hot button issue on a global scale. But you have to take a look at what Palestinians were really upset about. There's a lot of argument that, well, it's not traditionally Palestinian land either. Technically, let's be honest, politically, it belonged to the British. They could do whatever they pleased with it. And the argument is that there was no area known as Palestine for many, many, many hundreds of years until the British created it in 1920. And so this gives rise to people on the other side countering and saying that, well, yeah, Israel is a created state, but so too was Palestine not many years ago. But when we look at this from a Palestinian perspective, they're not just angry with the Jewish settlers. This isn't just a conflict of religion. That's a very big part of it. But they're upset that global organizations like the UN, who oversaw this partition of the land and the creation of Israel, and their leading member states like the US, the UK, and France, the ones who are really driving the push for Israel to be created, they're angry with those nations because what they're looking at is they're seeing more people coming in from the outside world and telling them what's going to happen with the land that they live on. Furthermore, their Arab neighbors, people living around this area of Palestine, they are very resentful of the settlement of Jewish people in the Middle East. Not, again, just because of the religious schism, but because what they're looking at is they have been colonized for a number of years. They've been taken over by other people, and they're sick and tired of it. And so they see the movement of Jewish people into this territory and the creation of the Israeli state as just a further extension of Western colonialism. Other nations, people mainly from Europe and in this instance the United States, coming over and telling them what's going to happen in their area of the world. Violence erupts almost immediately with the settlement and creation of Israel. And so, as soon as Jewish people start moving in and forming the Israeli state, we have the Israeli civil war between Jewish Israelis and Muslim Israelis, or Palestinians, living in the territory in 1947 and 1948. Then you have a coalition of Arab states kind of coming together to fight against Israel in 1948, that same year. So, I mean, it's just kind of like war after war. And then you have the Suez Crisis between Egypt and Israel in 1956, and then the 6 Days War in 1967. And so the 6 Days War is one in which Egypt is greatly expanding their territory and grabbing a lot of land. And then there's a really key war in 1973 known as the October or the Yom Kippur War. This is where Syria and Egypt, backed by Soviet weapons, attacked Israel to try to take back lands that they lost in the 6 Days War of 1967. The United States, because of the Cold War climate, is going to throw their support, their weaponry, their logistics, their ammunition, their resources behind Israel. And so what ends up happening here is that from this time, from 47 really on forward, the United States has been an unabashed backer of the Israeli state. And a lot of that has to do with Cold War tendencies. Because the Russians or the Soviet government is very ready and willing to give resources to places like Egypt and Syria to try to fight Israel and to try to take over Israel and crush the Israeli state, the United States saw it as their duty to prop up this democratic society of Israel against communist aggression. And so the United States is always looked at, throughout the history of the Cold War, looked at Israel as sort of a proxy battleground. This is an area where the United States can prop up a democratic capitalist society against the influence of communist societies, or at least communist-backed societies that are taking Soviet help. So, the United States supports Israel in the Yom Kippur War or the October War, and what ends up happening is an organization known as OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which, as from the name suggests, that they're going to largely be in the Middle East. They place an embargo on U.S. oil shipments. In other words, when the United States goes and throws that support behind Israel in 1973, the major oil exporting countries of the Middle East, which are mostly Muslim, decide, well, in that case, we're not shipping you oil anymore. And so that's how they're going to try and strike back at the United States for that support of Israel. And this is coming at a very bad time because the United States is suffering an extreme economic hangover. We are really, by the 1970s, going to start to get hit with things that start with problems that really began in the 1930s. We can go all the way back to the Great Depression and say that there was unchecked spending during the Great Depression, but no raising of taxes. And so they were largely able to cover this because World War II happened. And the United States dumped millions and millions and millions of dollars into the private defense industry, creating lots of jobs, which created new tax revenues. In other words, all of the money that FDR spent on the New Deal is going to be covered up by the amount of money and jobs that are created by World War II. But by the time we get to the 1960s, we have this very turbulent society. There's not a lot of big business being developed in the 1960s because the civil rights movement, Vietnam War, all the incumbent protests, the New Left, the Native American rights movement, the Hispanic rights movement, or Chicano rights movement, all of this sort of social disruption made for very bad economic growth, and that's just the fact of the matter. We also can put in on top of that, Lyndon Johnson had his Great Society plan rolled out in the 1960s, and he spent tons of money on that, and he spent tons of money fighting in the war in Vietnam, and so that created acute economic problems for the U.S. because the federal government spent billions on the Great Society Plan. They spent, millions. They spent millions on Vietnam, but they never raised tax revenues. They didn't raise taxes on the American taxpayer, and that means that the government is spending money they simply don't have. They can't cover the cost. So they're spending money that isn't accounted for, and that's a big problem economically. Federal spending directed tons of cash into the economy. And so what they've been doing basically is creating all these defense industry jobs because we're fighting wars all over the world, or at least wars by proxy. You still need to create Stinger missiles if you're going to sell them to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Something we're not really going to get into too deeply because of where we're going to be cutting this in the 1970s. But this is something that we're infusing all this cash into the economy, but it's all government produced cash. And ultimately, inflation starts rising steadily. And then on top of that, the end of the Vietnam War in the early 1970s brings with it the cancellation of giant government defense contracts. And so that shrinks U.S. job markets. Ever since World War II, the defense industry have been one of the biggest employers in the United States. So after Vietnam, when we start to take money away from this industry, we lose a lot of jobs. And then you put on top of that the fact that we're bringing home thousands upon thousands of working age men who need jobs now. When they're leaving Vietnam, they're coming back, they're leaving the military, they need to find work. And this puts further stress on the job market. And so when you look at the oil embargo, and that's something we're going to take a look at in a minute or two, when you look at what's happening in the 1970s after 73 and the Yom Kippur War, it's all being heaped on top of an already pretty bad economic situation in the United States. And so the U.S. at this point in the 1970s represents about 6% of the world's overall population. But the nation consumes a staggering 40% of global energy resources. In other words, the United States is using more energy than our fair share, than we have people. And so the U.S. is incredibly reliant on foreign oil markets. They need foreign oil, and most of it is being produced in the Middle East. And they look to the Middle East to meet those energy demands. About 12% of U.S. oil came from OPEC nations. So, when OPEC puts that oil embargo on the United States in 1973, it devastates our economy. It disrupts international shipping and domestic shipping. It disrupts business flow because you simply can't move your products around by plane, train, or automobile. And then also, it creates this really acute problem for the average American citizen because it's not just about the big business that can't get a fleet of trucks and oil and gas in order to power them. If you are a person living in the United States in 1973, 1974, you could go to a gas station, wait in line for a mile. You'll be there for 2 hours, and then when you get to the pump, there's no gas left. And so people are just struggling on a day-to-day basis. This isn't some ethereal, abstract economic problem. This is hitting Americans on a day-to-day basis. So, in 1974, the United States, because of all these factors, entered into the worst recession since the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there was high unemployment, and that went hand in hand with declining wages and the cost of consumer products, prices. So wages are going down, prices are also going down on the open market. So the price of bread drops alongside everybody else's wage in the United States. There's a different problem in the 1970s. You have really high unemployment, but that's coupled with rising prices because of inflation. This is a process that we call stagflation. I don't want to get too deep. I'm not an economics guy, but this is an important concept. The problem with stagflation is if you try to fix the high unemployment, it makes the inflation worse. And if you try to fix the inflation, it makes the unemployment problem worse. And so you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. No matter what you try to do to fix this problem, you're going to make the other problem in the American economy worse. And that's why this is a bit harder to solve even than the Great Depression, because really smart economists who understand these things are looking at it, scratching their heads, going, I don't know how to fix this. We have a very serious problem. And so ultimately, government spending remained really, really high on social programs and social welfare programs, but the tax bases from which funding for these programs should be coming kept dropping and dropping and dropping. And because of that, the federal deficit just skyrockets. The United States economy is, I'm just going to put it real bluntly, it's in the toilet in the 1970s. And essentially, this is the result of decades of economic mismanagement, spending without raising taxes. It's very unpleasant, and you don't, well, let me just be clear, you don't win elections by coming out to the American people and going, hey, look, you want a lot. You want social welfare programs. You want subsidized housing. You want all of these spending programs at the federal level, but you don't win elections by going, you got to pay for it. Money has to come from somewhere. And so generally what's happening is the politicians from World War II onward, really, they're all trying to kick the can down the road. Nobody wants to be the guy who's in power or who is going to have to try to win an election by going, look, it's about time that we face facts and own up to the fact that we've been economically irresponsible and somebody's got to pay for it. Well, that time of reckoning came in the 1970s. Somebody had to pay for it in 73 and 74. And so that's the way that generally worked out. That's the kind of economic problems the United States is looking at there. Now, you have this high rate of unemployment all over the United States. But we can point out two key industries that are collapsing in the 1970s that are directly driving this super high unemployment rate. Those are the auto industry in Detroit and the steel industry in pretty much across the Midwest. So the steel industry is one that kind of extends all the way from Pennsylvania, sort of eastern Pennsylvania, all the way across Ohio, going up to Wisconsin and Minnesota. Those are the big steel industry areas of the United States. When we look at this process, and then of course you have Detroit, my hometown, has always been synonymous with the auto industry. In 1970, the big three automakers, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, they held 89% of domestic auto markets, meaning every 100 cars you saw on the street, 89 of them were made by Ford, General Motors, or Chrysler. Now, by 1980, if we just go through this one decade, that number has dropped down to 66%. Because there's this ongoing crisis with the availability of gas, Americans wanted smaller, more fuel efficient cars. And that gas crisis is just getting worse and worse. And so that leads them to turn towards Japanese automakers. The Japanese were eating the Americans' lunch when it came to being able to make a smaller, more affordable, fuel efficient car. The Americans are still making these big old gas guzzling muscle cars and trucks. That's the market they have. But the Japanese, like Honda, Toyota, they start to creep in and they take a good share of the American auto market. So that by 1980, 44 out of every 100 cars is going to be a foreign made car rather than 11. And so this is one area where the United States is going to absolutely get destroyed, and that's a huge industry for the United States. At that point in time, Detroit was America's third largest city, third or fourth, depending on how you sussed it out. But it basically held the economic position that Houston holds in today's economy. It's a very important economic city here. But Detroit, from that point forward, is just going to be going downhill. And I can promise you, as somebody who was born and raised there in the 1980s, it still has not recovered. Detroit put all of its eggs into the auto basket, and they've never been able to regain what they had prior to the 1970s. In 1950, if we're going to go back, I'm looking at steel now. If we go back to 1950, the U.S. produced almost half of the world's steel. By 1980, it only produces about 14% of the world's steel. And again, we're getting outcompeted mostly by the Japanese. They're the ones who are stepping in to fill that void. They are capitalizing on new technologies. The Japanese figured out a more efficient way to smelt the iron, and to basically their furnace technologies are better than what the United States is using. And so they take a huge share of the global steel industry, and that leaves Americans, like I said, from Pennsylvania all the way up to Minnesota, completely broke. The Midwest just completely, it dies. This used to be the industrial epicenter of the United States. When you were talking industrial manufacturing, you were talking the American Midwest. Detroit, Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Scranton, Pennsylvania, Columbus, Ohio. These are the Erie, Ohio, places along the Great Lakes. These were the big industrial centers of the United States. But by 1980, the Midwest is just a collection of decaying industrial cities. The factories close down. The workers get laid off and lose their jobs. And more citizens start turning towards these federal assistance programs that are costing so much money, but tax dollars are not coming in to fund them. And so it really becomes this acute problem. And that's why this area, and this is a key term you're going to want to know for the exam, this area becomes known as the Rust Belt. And like I said, this is my hometown where I grew up. You could drive through Detroit and entire swaths of the city are just burnt out. They're just old factories and old houses that have been abandoned for decades. And then a fire breaks out because, homeless people are sleeping in there and lighting fires. All manner of illicit activity going on. But it's just entire swaths of the city are just burnt out and unpopulated. And that's still true right up until the present. And it's like that not just in Detroit, but in Gary, Indiana, in these towns in Ohio and Wisconsin. And so this area becomes known as the Rust Belt. They're just sitting there. These once vibrant economic centers of the U.S. are just sitting there gathering rust. Now, most of America's industrial production shifts south to the Sun Belt, and so this is because laborers in the South are not unionized. So places like Phoenix, Houston, San Diego, Atlanta, they all go through an industrial boom. While the Midwest is collapsing and dying, the South is jumping up and becoming the new industrial center of the United States. And again, because the automakers, if you're at a Ford plant in Detroit, you've got to pay someone $60 an hour to put a rubber band on a piece of plastic. And if they come in high on coke, you can't fire them. You have to pay for them to go through rehab. This is all ridiculously expensive. And the American auto companies say, if I have to pay a low level, unskilled worker that kind of money and put that much investment into them, I cannot compete with the Japanese. And so the industries start moving south because in the South, they're not unionized. If you come in high on coke, you're fired. And no, I don't need to pay you $60 an hour to put a rubber band on a piece of plastic. I can pay you $6 an hour because that's going to help me be able to compete on a global market. And so what you're seeing is that the cities of the South become big because unions don't have a strong presence in the South. The unions were very, very strong in the American Midwest in what now is the Rust Belt. And I've given you some images showing the shifting economic paradigms there and showing what Detroit really starts to look like. There's also a bit in your textbook chapter and in my lecture about the beginning of the computer age. And that's something that you'll definitely want to take a look at because as some industries are dying, we start to invest in computer technology, aerospace, some of these cutting edge technological sorts of industries to replace the steel and auto and things that we'll never be able to get back. And of course, coal is right there amongst us when you start getting into West Virginia and Pennsylvania, Kentucky, coal country. Those areas are collapsing as well. So, that brings us to some sort of adjustments that are going to be happening within the political realm as they sort of pertain to the ongoing issue of civil rights. And so, really, we have Nixon still in power at the beginning of the 1970s, and he's constantly reaching out to what he calls the silent majority. He believes that he and the Republicans are getting their support from blue collar workers in the North, Southerners who don't want to vote for racial equality or don't want to see integration happen at a quick rate. And then also, he's looking at basically the suburbs of the United States as being a key area where people are working class, but they have a little bit more money. The assumption is that they're mostly moderate people who can be swung either between Democrats or Republicans. So the silent majority is something that's very, very important to Nixon and to the Republicans, trying to get a voter base in the same way that the Democrats had done with the New Deal in the 1930s. So Nixon makes every effort to rein in the very liberal Supreme Court of Chief Justice Earl Warren. You remember talking about Warren and some of the advances that were made in the Supreme Court under his direction. And so he really wants to stop that liberal interpretation of the Constitution that's been happening under Warren's Supreme Court. So when Warren retires in 1969, Nixon will appoint Warren Burger in the hopes that Burger is going to not further the liberal social agenda that had been taken up by Chief Justice Earl Warren's Supreme Court. So when Burger gets this job, when he gets in this role as the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he doesn't really do what Nixon wanted him to do. He actually picks up right where Earl Warren left off. And so Burger starts about tackling segregation or informal or de facto segregation in the North. So we looked at during the civil rights period the process of integration in the South and desegregation in the American South. And the process by which this happened was basically the federal government demanding that the South desegregate. And that is because the South had actual segregation laws on the books. It works differently in the North. And so the South fought vehemently to avoid desegregation. But by 1971, about 70% of African American kids in the South are in integrated schools. They might not have liked integration, but they eventually acquiesced and went along with it. The problem is, there was never any laws that allowed for segregation legally in the North. but that doesn't mean it wasn't happening. There is lingering segregation or de facto segregation in northern schools. What's basically happening is the North never said black kids and white kids don't go to school together. That's just the law. They didn't say that. What they said is kids in the same community go to school together. But whites live together and African Americans live together. And so there's this kind of the segregation is based on living patterns in the North. It's not a law, but because it's not a law, no, the federal government never stepped in and did anything about the lack of integration in northern schools. And so Berger gets onto the Supreme Court and he suggests busing. And this will become this major hot button issue in the mid 1970s. This is a paradigm in which both African American kids and white children would be bused to schools outside of their neighborhoods and their school districts, thus forcing integration. In other words, if in the North you're going to choose to live in entirely white and entirely black communities, then I'm going to take your kids out of your communities and send them to each other's schools. Therefore, we will force integration. So the epicenter, this is not going to be well received by northern whites, particularly in the suburbs. And so what happens here is the epicenter of the busing debate becomes Boston. Here, there is a major protest of 200 white high school students marching through the city streets saying that they should not have to put up with busing. There is an African American lawyer and civil rights activist by the name of Ted Landsmark. He happens to be walking across this group of 200 white kids who are protesting in Boston, and these kids set upon him and start beating him up, breaking his nose. Now, Landsmark is not a dumb guy. This guy knows how to turn an incident like this into a major PR cue for the civil rights movement. And so basically what Landsmark does is he very astutely releases photos of himself in the hospital with a big, massive bandage around his head and one over his nose, and you can see the blood leaking through the bandage from his broken nose. And this gets juxtaposed in newspapers with angry white mobs. And basically, Landsmark is successful in drawing attention to the problem of racial segregation and racial inequality in Boston. And Boston is going to have to take greater steps to deal with these racial tensions moving forward. However, the North had really put up a lot. Like I said, mostly suburban whites in the North put up a lot of resistance to this idea of busing. And while the argument over busing was being sort of discussed, Nixon had made a few more conservative Supreme Court appointments. And so this court, once you have more conservatives on it, they revised Berger's decision and stated that suburban school districts did not have to engage in busing with urban school districts. And so this is basically that what they do here is they say busing's the new law. But there's this caveat. If you're from a rich suburb, no, you don't have to send your kid into an inner city school, some rundown inner city school. And so what this does is it hastens an already evident process in America's cities, particularly in the North. And so what happens is there's already a process known as white flight going on in America's cities. But the busing issue in this caveat and way of getting out of having to engage in integrating the schools, it's going to increase the process of white flight. And so what happens is white people leave the cities themselves and they move into the suburbs. And when they do, a lot of jobs move with them and a lot of tax revenues move with them. And so what happens is it leaves inner city schools impoverished and almost entirely African American. So this busing thing did nothing to overturn the problem of basically informal or de facto segregation in northern schools. That's still a problem. But what it does is it creates an even more stark contrast. There's even less integration now because what happens is here's the city, and then that's almost entirely black, very impoverished, and no tax revenues, and their schools are in very poor shape because schools are funded by local tax revenues. Then around that, you have a ring of incredibly wealthy white suburban schools that are very highly ranked, that have a lot of resources, that have a lot of money to actually help educate their students. And so this process of white flight just gets worse and worse as a result of this caveat thrown on by the Supreme Court on the busing issue. And again, when you look at some of the images that I put up in the PowerPoint lecture, I use my own hometown of Detroit because not because I'm just trying to be like, hey, Detroit, whatever. It's not exactly something to be proud of. But Detroit is the most prevalent example of this happening in the United States. Detroit, you can see on the graph there, used to be almost entirely white, or it was largely white, and then as the African American population started rising, these two things cross paths, and the white population goes down, and the African American population goes up. And then I showed you a map there showing in dark red is the inner city schools where they have very, very little money. And as it gets pink, these are the white suburban schools that surround it. And so this is a particularly acute problem in a city like Detroit, where the population of Detroit today, I think, is somewhere around 89% African American. And so it's a very stark example of that kind of problem. Now, that's something that's going on during Nixon's presidency, but also we know, and you've looked through it in the textbook and in previous lectures, I kind of alluded to the Watergate scandal. So Nixon is going to have to resign in disgrace over Watergate and his subsequent attempts to try and cover up his interference in the election. That means that Gerald R. Ford is going to become the United States' newest president, and really he's an interesting case. I have to throw this out. He's the only president ever to come from the state of Michigan, dovetailing with our last conversation there. But he's the first president ever to hold office without winning a election as president or vice president. This situation's kind of weird here. Before Nixon resigned, his original vice president was a guy named Spiro Agnew. He was the governor of Maryland. But it came to light that he was taking rather extensive bribes. And so he had to resign as the vice president of the United States. And so even though Ford wasn't originally on Nixon's ticket, Agnew was, Ford got moved up. Nixon invokes the 25th Amendment and makes the House minority leader, who's a Republican, Gerald Ford, his new vice president. So then when Nixon quits, Ford takes the Oval Office and becomes president. So he was never elected vice president, nor was he elected president, but he made it all the way to that highest executive office. So Ford's reputation coming into the White House is stellar. It's not going to be the same when he leaves. He has a strong reputation as being a super honest guy, very socially moderate, very fiscally conservative, and he was always somebody who was seen as willing to work across party lines. He was a great compromiser. He worked just as well as Democrats as he did with Republicans. And he really tended to work on his conscience. He wasn't a believer in racial segregation. He wasn't a believer in prejudice or bigotry or bias. But he also wasn't a believer in constant spending on social welfare programs. So he represented a really nice sort of moderate medium politician. But when he comes into office, the very first thing he does will, for many, 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 particularly Democrats or liberal-leaning people, cement him as being a terrible president and leaving an awful legacy. He comes in and immediately gives a full, free, and absolute pardon of Nixon. He says, we're not going to try Nixon for any of the crimes he committed in relation to Watergate. Now, he says, ostensibly, he says he's doing this because, and if you read a biography of Ford and you know a little bit about the man himself, he's probably telling the truth. His attitude is, look, Watergate was ugly. The last decade of American history has been super ugly. It's been protest after protest, anger, assassinations, killings, cheating, lying, fixing elections, cheating in elections. It's just ugly stuff, and he's sick and tired of bad news being the headline every single day. So what Ford wants to do is just say, look, yeah, we could try him, but it's going to be really expensive, and it's going to be a long, ugly process that just keeps rehashing all this negative stuff. He's gone. He quit. He resigned in disgrace. Let's just move on. And so he gives Nixon a full and absolute pardon. Most Americans are going to see this as a shady backroom political deal made between two Republicans. And because of this, Ford's approval rating drops to 42%. He is not going to be very successful in his endeavors as a president, mostly because of that first act. Now, Ford wants to restore faith in the presidency, and he wants to create a public image that positions the United States as an invincible global superpower. But he also wants to sidestep fears that the United States is militarily overextended around the globe. And so, rather than engaging in wars like we had in Korea and Vietnam in the midst of the Cold War, he is going to start to increasingly try to influence foreign politics from a covert position using this Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. In 1974, while he's in office, the New York Times sheds light on the CIA's involvement in overthrowing the democratically elected but Marxist government of Salvador Allende in Chile. And so, what starts to happen here is with this first New York Times article, it becomes clear to American people that when he's saying, I don't want to get involved in these big, ugly, extended wars, what he really means is, I'm going to use our military and intelligence resources out of sight where the American people can't approve of it. And he's going around overthrowing democratically elected governments. And it soon comes to light that he's doing this in a lot of different places. It's similar arrangements have been made in Cuba, in the Congo with Patrice Lumumba, in the Dominican Republic. So basically, what he's doing is just like he had done in Chile. There's financial and informational support for the CIA, propping up anti-Soviet and pro-American leaders. In the case of Chile, it's a guy by the name of General Augusto Pinochet. He sees his power from Allende. Here's the problem is the United States backs this guy. He's anti-Soviet. He's anti-communism. He's pro-American. Great. That's all fantastic. Except he is a horrible dude. He goes on to a 16-year reign of terror over his own citizens. If you speak out against him, you disappear in the middle of the night and your family is executed. And these are the types of people that we're making deals with around the world. And the American people they don't even know about it until the New York Times publishes things about it. Puts out op-eds and different pieces about this. So, ultimately, Ford is found out. And this is how the United States had been dealing with the Cold War since Vietnam. We're not going to get involved in a big, lengthy battle that costs a lot of time and money. We're just going to go in and do things we shouldn't be doing in other countries and overthrowing their governments, despite what their people want. And so, to combat all these new accusations that the United States is acting basically very imperially over other areas of the world, Ford steps forward and makes it illegal for any government employee to engage in or conspire with others in assassination plots. So this is his olive branch. So he says, look, American employees or employees of the American government, they're not allowed to conspire to kill anybody in other governments anymore. And so this is how he's trying to appease the American people, but clearly that doesn't go far enough. The United States is still sending aid to people like Pinochet in Chile. They have a military junta that gains control of Argentina in 1976. The United States is sending money to them, even though they're committing nonstop human rights violations. And so it's just this process where the United States has taken a different position. Now they're starting to meddle in the affairs of other independent nations. And that's not really democracy. That's not really the way that we have been positioning ourselves as a global superpower. We're always trying to help you if you want democracy, not oppress you if you don't want democracy. And so that's something that they were doing all over in Africa, in Southeast Asia as well, and then also in very heavily in Latin America. Rather than using our military, we just use ultimately the CIA to go in and try to meddle in those affairs. So when it's all said and done, with Ford's presidency, you get two different views of the guy. If you're conservative, you tend to look at him as a great mender, as a guy who basically, he came in, he didn't lie, cheat, or steal. He told when he got caught with using the CIA for these things, he didn't go, no, I didn't do that. No, it was this guy, and start pointing fingers like Nixon did. He says, yeah, we've been doing that stuff for years, and if you guys don't want us to do it, I'll try and tone it down and dial it back a little bit. And so that's how he deals with it. And so he comes off as being really, he uses openness, decency, honesty. And a lot of people look at him and said he was exactly what we needed in the mid-70s, which is somebody to come in and calm everything down. But then there's the other view, mostly from modern day liberals, who say that he was a terrible president because many of the conservatives that are going to show up again during the Reagan years and the Bush years, um, they get their start under Ford. He gets guys like Rumsfeld and Kissinger. These are the guys that are going to continue to have a lot of influence over Republican politics for decades to come. And they're sort of ushered in during Ford's presidency. Ford makes some definite moves about trying to step back the Cold War tension, mostly by sort of advancing this idea of mutually assured destruction. In other words, what this is, it's a concept that says, look, neither us or the Soviets are going to fire nukes at one another because if one person shoots, the whole world is dead. And so our mutually assured destruction guarantees that we're not going to enter into an open conflict with one another. But Ford is going to go up for re-election. No, I shouldn't say re-election. He goes up for election for the very first time for an executive branch office in 1976. But he faces an incredible challenge from within the Republican Party, and that's from a guy named Ronald Reagan. Reagan is a former actor, very, very prominent Hollywood actor, and the son of New Deal advocates. So the son of very liberal Democrats who basically gained advantage from FDR's policies in the 1930s. But he's the conservative governor from California. And in the 1976 primaries, he almost wins the Republican nomination. But Ford is able to ultimately beat him back just because Reagan is a little bit too hardcore on his anti-communist stance. He forms his ideals during the Second Red Scare. So his dad actually feeds the family thanks to liberal New Deal policies in the 1930s. But Reagan, for his money, he's a Hollywood actor, very well renowned. Let's just put it this way. He's a Hollywood guy, he's super rich during the Second Red Scare. He does not like communism. And this is generally true of anybody who makes money. If you have a lot of money, why would you want to buy into a political system that says you shouldn't have so much money? We're going to take your money and give it to somebody else. This is not something that sits well. So he becomes staunchly anti-communist. He almost wins that primary, but Ford would win. He would become the Republican nominee in 76, and he goes up against a peanut farmer from Georgia by the name of Jimmy Carter. Carter had won office and became the governor of Georgia, but he grew up in a family of farmers. He was a devout Southern Baptist, and he was generally seen as an outsider who had not been corrupted by Washington politics at that point. Neither candidate draws much support from the public. Less than 55% of the electorate even bothered to show up to vote in the 76 election. That shows you the apathy on the part of voters for both of these candidates. Nobody looked very good. But because of the ongoing economic woes of the 1970s, that hurts the incumbent. That hurts Ford. Ford's backroom pardon of Nixon, that doesn't help Ford's reputation. And Carter's ability to still draw in votes from the New Deal coalition. The relatively unknown Carter goes on to carry this election and becomes president after 1976. But your boy Reagan's going to be coming back in 1980, and he is going to basically form up what is the modern Republican voting base. But first, we need to take a look at some of the major issues of the Carter presidency. Carter is a hardworking guy, and he's very meticulous. And he is always trying to create this image of himself as a populist, as a man of the people kind of a thing. Many of his acts are designed to appease his liberal voting base. One of the first things that he does is he pardons 10,000 Vietnam War draft resistors. So basically, people would refuse to go and fight in the war. He gives them all a pardon. This is extremely unpopular with conservatives in the United States. Carter also is going to set up the Department of Education to oversee America's schools. And he sets up a super fund to start cleaning up America's most polluted areas. In fact, the environmental agenda as being part of the liberal cause does not exist until Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is the one who brings environmentalism into American politics as an issue. Carter is also going to appoint an unprecedented number of minorities and women to office during his presidency. However, Carter's not full-on liberal. He breaks from his liberals in terms of his outlook on finance and financial and fiscal responsibility. He's very conservative in that way. One, he doesn't think that raising the federal deficit and increasing federal funding would ease any of America's economic woes. He also felt that the liberals wanted to overregulate America's private sector, and that this was only going to make America's businesses hurt even more and the economy even worse. He was also able to get Congress to go along with his plan for deregulating trucking, communication, and the airline industries. And so these are industries that are going to really, one, if you look at all of that, they're super reliant on oil. So what he's trying to do is give them a break in the midst of the oil crisis. But it's also something that if you're looking at it from a liberal perspective, he shouldn't be giving tax breaks to big business. And so that's something that he really gets lambasted for by his liberal counterparts. So the resulting outcome of his efforts here is the 1978 energy bill. What this does, he finally gets this passed and put into law in 78, but it lifts price controls on oil. And it raised sales tax on gas guzzling cars and offered tax incentives for anybody who's investing in alternative energy sources like coal or solar energy. But the removal of federal controls would please the laissez-faire Republicans, the ones who are still saying, get the government out of our private sector. But the environmentally friendly, oil-reducing policies, they appeased enough liberal Democrats to get this bill passed. So he's really, again, what he's trying to do is not just pander to one side of politics or the other. He's trying to appease both. But Carter is going to be beset by a number of setbacks in his presidency that's going to make him a one-term president and widely unpopular. The first thing that really goes wrong during Carter's presidency is there is another major gas crisis. So his legislation makes people happy on both sides, but it had wide-reaching consequences, and they're not very good. So price controls have been lifted on oil, but the taxes weren't raised on oil and gas companies. As a result, OPEC was allowed to come in and just start. That's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They raised the price of oil 4 times in 5 months in 1979. You couple that with a coup in Iran that ousted their moderate U.S. friendly government, and then, so they stopped producing any oil and sending it to the United States, and OPEC is raising the prices on oil. All of this put together is going to create a serious problem. By June of 1979, nearly half of America's gas stations have run out of gas. And this is going to create monster headaches for the average American worker. But at the same time, as the average American worker can't even fill his car up with gas, even if he has the money to do so, Exxon is reporting its first quarter earnings of $1 billion, which is a record profit for any American company up to that point. So the oil companies are making buku bucks, hand over fist, lots of money. The American worker, the average person, is suffering immensely under Carter's policies. So he again comes out in the midst of this 1979 gas crisis. He comes out and he reintroduces the notion that oil and gas companies should pay higher corporate taxes. But really, that message gets lost. It's all part of something known as his malaise speech. He goes on the TV in front of a national audience, and he doesn't put on the suit and the red tie with a blue shirt or a white shirt, very presidential garb. No, he sits there in like a Mr. Rogers looking cardigan, and he's sitting in front of a fireplace. Some people call it his fireplace speech. But basically what he does is he goes, yeah, we got this problem and we need to change the way we tax oil and gas companies. But really, you people need to stop driving gas guzzling cars. You people need to stop relying on foreign oil so much. You need to really get over it and start thinking about the future and how we're going to deal with this. Now look, even if his message environmentally, economically might be the right one, this doesn't win him any friends. People are suffering. He goes on TV dressed like Mr. Rogers and blames the American people for it. So his sermonizing, his lecturing, it didn't do much to help his cause. And it led a lot of people, conservative, liberal, anything in between, from that point forward, they just straight up do not like Jimmy Carter. He comes on TV and talks down to them while they're suffering, and that's not something that they're really looking to hear at that point. They're sitting there in lines waiting to try and get gas for hours every day. And most people can't even fill up their cars. There's limits on gas, like there's been limits on other things throughout U.S. history when the economy goes bad. But all he can do is sit in front of a fireplace and tell the American people to grow up and stop relying on oil. So that's not going to work out real well. In addition to all that, Carter is going to, in terms of domestic policy, he's not getting anywhere. He's not winning any friends or allies in the United States based on his domestic policy because what's going wrong here with the gas crisis. But his foreign policy is where he really wants to kind of stake his legacy. But he doesn't do a great job with that either. Carter looks at our situation in Latin America and he says, look, the United States has earned, and rightfully so, has earned a reputation as an imperial bully in Latin America. And really, what we need to do is start looking more into human rights causes and spreading democracy as part of our foreign policy down there. His first step is to arrange a transfer of the Panama Canal back to Panama. This was going to take place during his presidency, but it gets pushed off to 2000. And so it was agreed upon during Carter's term in '78. But let's be honest, even by 1978, the Panama Canal was useless. Most international shipping freights couldn't fit through the canal anymore anyway. And more people were taking to the air and shipping things by air. So Carter also tries to normalize relations with Castro, but Castro basically tells him where he can stick it. He is not. Castro goes, I don't care about you, and I don't want to normalize relations with the United States. Get out of my face. And so this looks really bad on all fronts. Republicans just mock him and say, you basically go to a dictator and try and open up good relations with him, and he spits in your face. Wow, you've embarrassed the United States of America. And liberals largely say the same thing after this. They go, hey, before you start announcing all these things and making it very public, you may want to get a better feel for what's going on in foreign nations. And then you have in other areas, you have Carter offering economic aid to communist governments. This is going to be ripped apart by conservatives who are anti-communist and still in this. This is in the middle of the Cold War. He's giving money to communist-backed Sandinistas in places like Nicaragua, all the while saying how we need to promote human rights and democracy in these nations. Well, the people he's giving money to turn around and kill a bunch of their own citizens, commit a bunch of human rights atrocities, and take all of his money and start basically suppressing any sort of democracy within these nations. And so, even though he wants to make a name for himself in foreign policy, he fails miserably at doing it in Latin America. Things don't get much better for him in Asia or Africa or Europe either. He's basically going to allow the spread of Soviet-backed governments all around places like Afghanistan. You're going to see that happening in Somalia, Ethiopia, Angola. They all become communist governments. And so it's very easy, again, in the midst of the Cold War, to look at Carter and go, what are you doing? You're just screwing everything up. And so in those areas of the globe, his foreign policy is not going to be anything that really helps pull him out of the fire here. And so another crippling blow is made to U.S.-Soviet relations in 1979. This is when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in order to prop up a communist government there that had come under attack by pro-capitalist rebels. So the Soviets are trying to keep a communist buffer zone on their southern border. But the U.S. interprets this, and kind of wrongly so, as the Soviets trying to expand and make inroads into the all-important oil-producing Middle East. So in response, Carter introduces something known as the Carter Doctrine. This was a declaration that the U.S. was prepared to use armed force to stop any outside power from meddling in the Persian Gulf region. When he says this, he basically is threatening the Soviets. Don't come anywhere near the Middle East. That's ours. Leave it alone. And if you do, I will use the army, I swear. He also goes ahead and withdraws from the Strategic Arms and Limitation Treaties Pact, increased defense spending, and cuts off all shipments of food and technology to the Soviets. He even goes forward and boycotts the Summer Olympics that are being held in Moscow. To stop the Soviet advance in Afghanistan, Carter is going to back fundamentalist Muslim rebels without vetting what this organization's true goals are. This is a group of people known as the Mujahideen, and they're being led by a number of Saudis. And among these Saudis fighting in Afghanistan is a young college graduate bent on establishing an Islamic state in Afghanistan. This is a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden. You should be familiar with him. He would go on to found Al Qaeda using U.S. money and weapons that he acquired in Afghanistan. So bin Laden, as you know, is also going to go on to organize numerous terrorist attacks against the United States embassies in Africa, namely Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. In East Africa, he's going to bomb the World Trade Center once in 1993 and then again in the 9/11 attacks. So his again, when we look at the overall sort of fallout of Carter's policy, basically what he did is he went and backed somebody and gave weapons and money to somebody who hated the United States of America. So that all comes down now to a very specific section of the Middle East. Carter is absolutely getting crushed. He is getting crushed domestically. He's getting crushed in foreign policy circles. Nobody is really getting on board with what Carter's selling. So he knows that his one last ditch effort to try to make things sort of salvage his foreign policy reputation is negotiating peace between Israel and their neighbors in the Middle East. To do this, in 1978, he invites Anwar el-Sadat, who's the president of Egypt, and Israel's prime minister, a guy by the name of Menachem Begin, to Camp David in Maryland. So for 13 days, these two leaders were involved in tense negotiations that were brokered by Jimmy Carter, and this all led to the Camp David Accords. This is the crowning achievement of the Carter presidency. In these accords, Israel agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt in 1982. Egypt would, in return, become the first, not technically Arab, but they were part of something called the League of Arab States. They were the first Arab state to recognize Israel's right to exist. And so the U.S. agreed to give substantial military aid and support to both Israel and Egypt when they signed the accords. So this was a major thing for Carter because Israel, when you look at the rest of the Middle East and all of Israel's enemies in that region, in the late 70s and early 80s, Egypt was the only credible military threat to Israel's safety. So in establishing the Camp David Accords, Carter did go a long way towards ensuring that that government in Israel would remain propped up for the time to come. Sorry, my cat's got a cone on his head and he really wants to get in front. So sorry, wave to everybody. Hi. All right, he's not real happy right now. So the last thing that you need to be aware of in terms of the Carter presidency is the Iranian hostage crisis. So essentially what's happening within the Iranian hostage crisis is the United States is going to allow a sorry, the cat is wreaking havoc with the camera here. In October of 1979, Carter is going to allow the newly ousted but sick Shah of Iran. The Shah was the leader of pro-American moderate government in Iran, and he was thrown out by Islamic fundamentalists under the command of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in 1979. And so, essentially, the Shah's living in exile, and in October of 79, Carter decides to allow him to come into the United States from Mexico to get medical treatment. In response to the United States allowing the Shah to come in for this medical treatment, a mob of university students in Iran's capital of Tehran lay siege to the American embassy. The students took all of the Americans in that embassy hostage to ensure the return of the Shah to Iran. They want this guy to be sent back to Iran so they can kill him. And so Khomeini didn't order the hostage taking, but he did support the students in their efforts to do it. In sum, 52 American hostages were taken and held for 444 days. That is over a year, and this is an event known as the Iranian hostage crisis. This episode became the defining event of the Carter presidency. And so, in a lot of ways, it's just kind of that's the icing on the cake of all of his failed foreign policy moves. His inability to secure the release of these hostages, who were shown on the nightly news blindfolded, with Iranians in the background pointing guns at him, slapping him in the back of the head, yelling "Death to America." This led to his approval rating dropping down to 28% by the end of his presidency. So there were a lot of people in Carter's cabinet that were arguing that he needed to ensure the hostages' safe release. And that just meant being patient. They're saying, look, don't get jumpy. If they get killed, that approval rating is going to go even lower than it already is right now. There's other people in his argument that are saying, look, the longer this goes on, the weaker you look in terms of foreign policy and you're in America's face to the rest of the world. And it's just hurting you and America all over. We need to move, and we need to move now. So, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan 1 month into the hostage crisis, the latter view starts to look a little bit more true. And Carter starts trying to effect some sort of rescue of these people who are being held by U.S. Special Forces. But it fails miserably. They're trying to land the helicopter in heavy rains. One of them crashes. It's just an absolute nightmare. So 5 months later, Iran came back to the negotiating table in light of them being invaded by Iraq. So under the new leader of Iraq, a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein, Khomeini was going to start negotiating with the United States, but Khomeini hates Carter so much that he actually waits until 5 minutes after Reagan is sworn into office as the new president of the United States. He waits 5 minutes. Reagan's been president for 5 minutes, and Khomeini goes, okay, I like this Reagan guy better than you, Carter, and he releases all the hostages. So this is really the kind of, like I said, the icing on the cake, the thing de la resistance when it comes to the failure of Carter's presidency on a foreign policy scale. So really, that is where we're going to wrap up our class right there. That brings kind of the 1970s to a close. Reagan is going to come in and win the 1980 election and take office. And when he does this. I just want to briefly wrap this up, and this will be the last thing I say because I think it has really lasting importance coming right up to the present. We looked at how the Democratic Party formed its voting base under the New Deal policies of the 1930s. Well, Reagan is going to do what Nixon could not. He is going to build the Republican voting base for the foreseeable future when he runs for president again in 1980. He gets this idea. He goes up north to these northern cities, and people are desperate. They're starving. They have nothing. And he says, in places like Detroit and Chicago, I'm going to bring industry back. I'm fiscally conservative. I'm going to get you guys back on your feet. And unlike that wimp Carter, I'm tough on communism, so I won't embarrass us in front of the rest of the world. This message plays well with the northern blue-collar workers. And he comes down to the American South and he goes, I know you're all broke. I know you're all hurting. I know you're all starving. And the people in the American South go, no, we're not. We're fine. And the message doesn't play. He can't use economics to get the South to vote for him. He has to find another way. So what he does is he turns to conservative Christian religious values. He partners with a guy named Jerry Falwell. And essentially, when he comes down south, he goes, you can't win a northern electorate by talking about Christian values. They don't care about that. They care about the fact that they're broke and their economy's in the toilet. But when you go down to the Sun Belt, where all the industry has moved, you can't come to the South and scare them into voting for you economically. So what he does in the South is he appeals to Christians, to conservative, fundamental Christianity, family values, husband and wife, no gay marriage. These are the kinds of things. And so he partners these two together. Social conservatism and religion mixed with fiscal conservatism. And this is what builds the modern Republican voting base. And that's how Reagan is going to win office in 1980, and then he'll win again in 1984. That's the last thing I'm going to say in this class, History 1306. I hope you all enjoyed it. As usual, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to drop me an email. Take care.